that if you are the sort of person who wants to be democratically engaged, you should. And I do think probably it's a good idea for people to do that more, partly because I think the kinds of people who are attracted to that are not necessarily the kind of people you want doing it. So, I mean, if you've been to like meetings of your party or your local government, they are not rewarding experiences, you know?
Thank you, Sergio, for that introduction, and to all of your colleagues for hosting us this evening. It's terrific to see so many of you come out, as Sergio said, for the first event of this year, I think for the Civil Society series, but also the Frontlines of Democracy, which is a subset of that series. And it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, the subject of our talk, Anne Norton. Democracy is an inherently risky form of politics. It empowers ordinary citizens, all of us, to govern ourselves, to be the author of our collective future. But the future is uncertain. How will the people decide? It's customary after every election to say, the people are always right, but sometimes we make mistakes, and we often make mistakes that can have terrible consequences. Nothing's on my mind at the moment. In any country. I'm talking about India at the moment. There are other reasons we might fear democracy. Political competition inevitably creates winners and losers. Electoral majorities can impose policies and change laws that harm minorities of various kinds, their interests, their status, their very being. Fear of tyranny of the majority leads us to establish norms, rules, and institutions that can limit the concentration of power, moderate how it's exercised. We separate powers and create checks and balances. We encourage social accommodation, ideological compromise, political self-restraint. Yet these norms and institutions may create political deadlock in turn, and a ruling elite more interested in its own reproduction than addressing the challenges we face. Fear of the unknown, fear of what people might decide, fear of each other might lead us to question democracy itself. As William Butler Yeats wrote, when we feel things fall apart and believe the center cannot hold, we might fear mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, where the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. In moments like these, we often search for stability and order. We demand security. We seek authority, even the rise of a strongman. But what if authoritarianism is the greater danger than anarchy? What if anarchy, understood as a condition of neither being ruled nor ruling someone else, is actually the nursery of democracy? What if the best way to realize the promise of democracy and contain its dangers relies on virtues like courage and self-discipline, and allowing ordinary citizens greater scope to govern their everyday lives? Our guest this evening has spent many years asking provocative questions like these. A scholar of political theory, Anne Norton is the inaugural Stacey and Henry Jackson President's Distinguished Professor, it's a mouthful, in political science at the University of Pennsylvania. Her groundbreaking work sits at the intersection of democracy, power, and identity. Professor Norton is a co-founding editor of Theory and Event and on the executive board of Political Theory, two flagship journals in the discipline. She also serves on the board of the Bridge Initiative at the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. She's the author of many books, such as Alternative Americas, a reading of antebellum political culture, published in 1986 by Chicago, 95 Theses on Politics, Culture, and Method, published in 2003, and Leo Strauss and the Politics of American Empire, published in 2004. Her latest book, which is the focus of her talk this evening, is Wild Democracy, Anarchy, Courage, and Ruling the Law. Anne will speak for about half an hour. I'll then start a conversation with her to explore some of the questions and themes in her book and her lecture before we open it up to your comments and questions. Please join me in welcoming Anne Norton.
I want to begin by thanking the Toronto Public Library, Sanjay and Sergio, and all the staff here for their help. And thanks to you for coming. It is the greatest compliment I could hope for, and it makes me very happy. I'm also very grateful for Sergio's land acknowledgement. I have increasingly turned to the study of the Indigenous in my own work, and I am particularly conscious of that debt. I'm also grateful for the title of this talk. I do want you to be unruly, or as Nietzsche says, I hate to govern and I hate to lead. Obey, oh no, and govern, no indeed. I think democracy and Democrats ought to be unruly, unruled. I want myself to be ungovernable, because it is only then that we can be governed by our own consent. Anarchy is often portrayed in a much darker fashion, the fashion that Sanjay mentioned, a picture of chaos, but a chaos that is characterized by a high degree of violence, so that we're told such and such a place, usually somewhere in the global south, will descend into anarchy. But that complete disorder that is referred to by media, by politicians, by professors, that's not usually what one sees. Instead, with a breakdown of established order, what you see is the rise of gangs, vigilantes, armed force, people with guns in the street. This is not anarchy. This is authoritarianism. And indeed, even if it's many people with guns in the street, it's still authoritarianism, because when someone pulls a gun on you, they are saying, do what I would have you do, because I can kill you. There is no moment of equality in that at that point. But anarchy is something different. Anarchy is the absence of rule. No one rules over you, you rule yourselves. And anarchy is much more ordinary. The great anarchist theorist Kropotkin, somewhat to my surprise, once argued that anarchy is reality. And I found this out not by reading Kropotkin or indeed any other theorist, but by watching. What happens in disasters? What happens when there's a flood or a hurricane or an earthquake or 9/11 or any natural or warlike disasters? The state might come eventually, maybe even fairly quickly. The city might come. But who comes first? The people who are already there. Your neighbors. People bring their rowboats to rescue flood victims who are stranded on the roof. People come to dig people out of earthquakes, and they come without any orders from anyone. They come because they see this as their duty, as something that they owe to themselves and owe to other human beings. They don't do it in response to rule or rules of any kind. They just do it. And watching people do this very ordinary kind of thing taught me that the capacity of people to act for themselves is really quite extraordinary. And we depend on it in ways we don't acknowledge at any point. I don't think anarchy is what we have to fear. I think anarchy is what we rely on. Think of it more in the most ordinary way. Who helps you out if you're sick? Who helps you out if they know that your family has fallen on hard times? Your family, your neighbors, people that you know. Or that's who does the work. And that is such a part of the fabric of ordinary life that we forget it. We forget how well we do when we are not ruled. Authoritarianism is less ordinary at the level of our daily interactions, but in terms of how people live their lives politically, what kinds of regimes there are in the world, Authoritarianism is much more ordinary than anarchy. I couldn't name a single anarchist government, anarchist place. There's a tiny little neighborhood in Copenhagen that's like that. No. But any of you could tell me 4 or 5 authoritarian rulers at the drop of a hat. And authoritarianism is the absolute antithesis of freedom. It does nothing except through fear and the threat of force. Under authoritarian rule, people live in constant fear. They can't do what they think best. So there's also a way in which authoritarianism stops people from thinking. It says you do what you must, or you restrain yourself because you must. But if you think, keep it to yourself. They can, politically, yes, but also in their own homes, because people internalize this. And there is no good side to this. There's no order. This is the promise of authoritarianism. It's terrible, but the strong man will bring you peace and order. But they don't. Their government can change at their whim. Their enemies change at their whim. You are always vulnerable, and they are always in charge. It's also difficult to escape. You can't just leave. So where are the anarchies? And why do we fear anarchy so much and authoritarianism so little? So I want to spare a moment to praise anarchy. And that's what this book fundamentally is, to praise the capacity of people to think and live and work for themselves, to exercise judgment, to work at common projects together, to do so in very ordinary ways in their homes, locally, but also at national and international levels. I also think that anarchy is how we get to democracy and how we keep democracy. That anarchy gives people the qualities that they need to be good Democrats. It teaches them 2 things. It makes them the kind of people who appreciate both freedom and solidarity, who appreciate their independence, but also their ability to do common work. And I learned this particularly by reading a long-dead Muslim philosopher named Ibn Khaldun. And Ibn Khaldun was particularly interested in the Bedouin because he saw that the Bedouin were both intensely self-reliant, but they were also really good at power. And the reason why they were really good at power was because they knew how to work together. And they did so voluntarily. Now, this was really a revelation to me because it taught me that self-reliance and solidarity aren't opposites. They're related as concave is to convex. Like, you have self-reliance and you have solidarity. They are the same thing in a certain sense. They are fundamentally bound together. And both of those qualities are qualities you need to do any common political work together. It's also something that I think is an easy principle for people in North America to grasp, because we all have, or not personally in most cases, but historically, the memory of frontier life, that we know what it is to live on a frontier. And that living on a frontier is what North American culture captures, that people are self-reliant, people are independent, people go their own way, but they also help each other out, they work together, they share, they join together in common projects. That's one way that anarchy is the nursery of democracy. But I think the most important way is that the ground of democracy is the consent of the governed. And true consent requires people who can say no. If you can't say no, there is no meaning to your consent. But what kind of people are those? And how are they made? Or how do they come to be? How do they make themselves? And it really is making yourself. When I was in the middle of this book, one of my friends who was reading it, parts of it in manuscript, said, "This is a book of ethics," which surprised me. I thought it was a book of politics. But it is a book of ethics in the sense is, how do you live this life? How do you live a democratic life? And what do you need to live a democratic life? And I think the first thing is courage. It's easy to see this in revolutionaries and rebels. It's easy to see this in the man who stands before the tank in Tiananmen Square, or a man who stands in front of a tank in Tahrir Square. Those people are easy to see. It's easy to see it in the memory of Selma and Birmingham and the civil rights marchers in the United States. And that is an important kind of courage. It's hard. It's hard to rebel. And classical political philosophy, at least in the West, actually not just in the West, tends to portray rebellion as something like an explosion. It's people's appetites and passions get the better of them. But when you look at rebellions and revolutions, it's not like that. And it's not like that for a very powerful reason. Someone who rebels against an authoritarian government, a monarchy, a dictatorship, they have to recognize that they will probably die. The odds are against them. But it's worse than that. It won't be just them. It will be their families. It will be people they respect. That they cannot be sure of winning, that they will very likely lose. So it takes a great deal of courage to take that risk, and a great deal of conviction. But I think ordinary democratic life takes courage, and takes courage in ways that we are less ready to recognize. First of all, my friends, the liberal theorists and constitutionalists, want us to secure democracy by institutions and stability. And there's a lot to be said for institutions and stability. But politics is not still, especially not democratic politics. Because, look around because it's not the people, it's people who rule in politics. And people change. They're born, they die. New ones come, especially in democracies. They immigrate here. And also, we change. We learn. We change our minds. So everything in a democracy is change. And this is not a bad thing. If you don't learn, you stagnate and you can't move forward. But that learning, that change, brings instability. So I think the vision of politics we should have is not of a stable house, but of a ship that you have to learn to sail. Things change all the time, and you must adjust all the time. You might need to change your course. And in fact, you will need to change your course. And that is something that we should not just accept, but welcome. It's also what we do. It's ordinary, but it is terrifying. It's so terrifying we can rarely bring ourselves to look at it. Because we have to acknowledge, when you go to the voting booth, maybe it's a little better in Canada, but I think it is fundamentally the same experience. You go to the voting booth, And your dominant feeling is, this is not really who I want. Right? It's frustrating. You sort of think, all right, I'll vote for this one. Every now and then you get a joyful vote, but I think I've had exactly 2 of these in my entire life. It's just not what happens. Instead, you make do. And sometimes the results are truly terrifying. And when that happens, what do people do? They are not mastered by their fear. They go on. I mean, you see people elected all the time who don't like you, don't like your politics, don't like the policies you like, might even wish you were not here, might wish you were dead, or at least that you did not exist. And yet we live with them. We live with them all the time. We take it for granted that we live with them. And the more you think about this, at least the more I think about this, the more astonished I am by it. It really takes an extraordinary kind of grace and courage to say, I walk among my enemies unafraid. Not only that, I engage in common projects with them sometimes, and I never let fear of them master me. And that, democracy depends on that. It depends on that in good times, and it depends on that in bad times, that we are not afraid. It may be that we will lose. But even if we lose, we will stand fast for our convictions, for the country we hope to have, for the people that we care about and respect and honor, for the principles we honor. And that standing fast with courage in hard times is one of the things that makes things possible both in the present and in the future. It restrains the people we fear, and it empowers the people who we honor and respect. And this comes up in the most ordinary policies, too. It's not just at election time. I mean, it's easy to see how heavily this can weigh on someone. This happily does not happen here. In the United States, the person with cancer whose hair is falling out or whose body is betraying them day by day, who can't get into a hospital or get health care, they have courage in the face of a devastating policy. But that's true for everyone in smaller ways. We all experience policies that burden or constrain us, and yet we survive that. We live with difficult policies, and we face them with courage. We live with our enemies, and we walk among them unafraid. This requires 2 other things of us. One of them is judgment. The younger people in my household like to say, don't judge. But I'm telling you exactly the opposite. You should judge all the time. It is your duty to judge. First of all, you need to judge politics. That's your job. I mean, in a democracy, it is your job. And if you want a democracy, it's your job. This policy is not good. This candidate is not as good. For this reason, you have to judge them. But also, you have to judge yourself. You have to ask yourself, am I following the correct policy? Am I behaving to these people who I believe to be my enemy in an honorable and respectable way while still fighting them as effectively as I can? And is the way I'm fighting them the right way, an effective way, an honorable way? We have to judge a lot. And we should be proud of the fact that we judge, because that judgment, it's part of our sovereignty. Now, When you write a book, as some of you probably know, when you write a book, you learn things. You really learn a lot. And so the book I wrote then is not entirely what I think about it now. I mean, it is what I think about it, but it taught me things. And one of the things it taught me was I used to have a very romantic idea of the people, and as the democratic sovereign. But I've come to think it's not like that. It's not the people, it's people. And this recognition was really important for me because the idea of the people is never present. And when you study the people, one of the things you start asking yourself is, does this include dead people? Which for most nations it does, because you care about certain people in your past that you honor. And does it include the future people? Well, usually yes, because we think about them. So it's a very difficult idea to work with in some ways. And it's also difficult because, of course, people say, you're speaking in the name of the people, but who are you? But if you think of sovereignty as people, two things happen. First of all, some of that sovereign is always present. Not just in politics, not just on election day, but every person you meet on the street is carrying that sovereignty within them, that capacity to act as a ruler in this country, within there. And they do this, of course, they don't have all of it, but they have some of it. And when they speak, when you speak, you can speak as someone who is subject to the laws, but you can also speak as someone who rules the laws. And it also makes you recognize that this is not something that happens occasionally on election day or in times of revolution or political actions. It happens all the time. And it doesn't just happen when you serve on a jury. It happens when you decide ordinary things in life, what laws you're going to obey, and which laws you will refuse to obey. And this is another one of those things that is so deeply built into our lives that we don't always notice it. You know, you come to a street and there's a stoplight and it's red, but nobody's coming. You probably cross. You don't cross. I know you cross. Because why wouldn't you cross? It's the rational thing to do. And it would be silly to obey a law so trivial that harms no one. So you don't do that. You just cross. And you can disobey laws that are silly. I have a list of silly laws, which I made up for random reasons. I mean, they're very silly, and I could have many more. Like in most parts of Pennsylvania where I live, state law requires that you stop every mile to send up a rocket signal. Obviously, this is a law that was written a long time ago. It is in Connecticut, it is illegal to educate dogs. I mean, I have dogs, and believe me, you want to educate your dog. What was another one? Oh, it is illegal to kiss on a train in Wisconsin. Now, these are silly laws, and I have to say, I hope you all, should you ever be on a train in Wisconsin, find someone to kiss. It's just silly. And that is the kind of law that one should disobey. No, not just to disobey, but because should it become desirable or necessary, you should just disobey it. And you don't even have to think about it. But there are also dangerous, silly laws. You know, there were laws here and there against interracial marriage. There were laws against cross-dressing. There are all the discriminatory laws that we have come to know throughout our histories. And those too should be disobeyed. And that may be more costly to disobey them. but they enable both us as individuals carrying sovereignty within us to keep our own self-respect, our own honor, and it also enables the country to move in that direction. And this is why I talk about the rule of law. That the rule of law is not, as it's normally understood, something that should just be honored. The rule of law is not always a good thing. There are bad laws. There are evil governments that have particularly evil laws. You can all think of one or two. I mean, the canonical example is Nazi Germany, a very law-abiding state, but the laws were not good. There was the Jim Crow South, not good. It's easy to find places like that. And those laws, we have a duty to disobey those laws and to undermine them when we can, to revolt against them when we can. But there is something about the rule of law that is beautiful, and that is that it has a double meaning. That on the one hand, laws rule us, but we also rule the law. Insofar as we are democrats, we rule the law. And we do that as a common work. So if we think of the rule of law as something that we do as rulers, as sovereigns, as the people who govern, that's a good thing. The law is our law, we consent to it, we make it, we have responsibility for it. And so it is a duty as well as a privilege to rule the law. Now, I want to say, sorry, I'm not good with technology all the time. I want to say just as a kind of coda, a little bit about two things, about the title of the book, Wild Democracy, and about the cover, which I'm particularly fond of. I called it Wild Democracy for two reasons. One, because it should be a little reckless. And in the book, I talk about wilder people than I have talked about so far, outlaws and bandits and Vikings. I'm very fond of Vikings. Vikings, one man, one vote. One woman, one vote. No difference. Any free human voted. So great. You could just come in and vote, which you actually, never mind. There are many interesting places, including unexpected places like the early United States, where people just came and voted. They didn't ask for your papers, they didn't ask for your immigration records, you came and voted. Didn't matter when you came. And of course, when my ancestors came, which was not all that long ago, they came as illegal immigrants because there were no legal immigrants. They were all illegal or legal, depending on how you thought of it. But at least one of mine was, without question, illegal because he stowed away. So I want to recognize what that wildness brings to Canada, to the US, to Mexico. It brings something to us that is really valuable and that we should love. But the other thing I liked about wildness is what wild things are. That wild things grow up in harsh places. You know, like it's a little cold here, but if it's warm or you're in a warm place and you're in a parking lot, you will often see weeds coming up and sometimes flowers. And if you're in, for example, Beirut, you'll see an orange tree coming up. And that wildness, those things that grow unbidden, that's a gift. And that capacity to come up in hard places, this is also something I think Democrats depend upon. That we need to be people who grow anywhere, who are common. And I don't think our aim should be to tame people. I think our aim should be to free people. To let to let people live the life they want to live. Most people, if you think about people that you know or see, most people most of the time try very hard. They try hard to take care of their families. They try hard to be good people. They really work to do these things. And often they are constrained in what they can do. And the freer they are to live the life they want to live, and to do, above all, to do the work that they want to do, whatever that work is, that will also be a gift to us. And I think democracy depends on our keeping that kind of wildness in us, both to preserve our democracies and also to preserve our own freedom and our own sense of our capacity to rule the law. Thank you so much for coming and listening.
So thank you, Anne. I had a chance to read this book, obviously for this event this evening, and I just would start by saying it's a really unusual book, even for those who read books like this, and philosophical tracts and political theory. It reads sometime, I said to a colleague, it's quite a trippy book. And what did I mean by that? Literally, I was like, am I really reading this? Is this person really saying this? And at times it feels almost like a bit like a reverie. There's a sort of utopian element to it, and yet there's an austere element to it. I think partly to do with the emphasis that Anne was, as you said in your own lecture, on courage and self-discipline. And so I often think of these virtues I associate, rightly or wrongly, with that kind of conservative tradition. As you say, it's sort of frontier mentality. And there's lots in the book, and you've touched on a lot of things. So I thought to start a conversation, there's so many of you here, so we want to open it up to your questions and comments too, but I thought I would try to start off with sort of three things. And you can push this book in lots of ways, and I find myself at times really agreeing and saying yes, and other times being resistant and saying, no, I don't agree with that. So let me try to do a little bit of both to start the conversation. So first thing would be, if you believe in freedom, and if you believe that democracies are citizens that are empowered, then it's certainly the case, and many scholars, many observers, many of us in this room would say, one of the biggest problems in our democracies today is so much of the power resides elsewhere, with political elites, with government institutions, with big corporations. They make decisions that impact our lives, and we feel powerless or helpless. So you're trying to reclaim that. Right? So the first question I guess to ask is, it's become standard to say what we need more civic participation in our politics, right? You should vote more. You should, if you're interested in a party, you should join the party. You should be part of a nomination process. You might stand for office. You might do all kinds of things that are part of the formal political process or public life generally. But in this book, and you're not saying that, but in this book you're emphasizing more about, as you say, anarchy means a space where you do not rule anybody, but nobody rules you either. So what is it that you're advocating to revitalize democracy? Because one view is that you revitalize democracy by making it more participatory. The term we use in Canada, I've discovered since I came back after 25 years away, is democratic engagement. I want to engage in public life in various ways. But you seem to be, your focus in the book is on the ungoverned spaces, where the state doesn't exist, where formal public institutions don't exist. So where is it that you're trying to cultivate? Where do you recommend trying to cultivate these virtues that you think are so important for us to practice freedom, to realize the freedom that so many people sort of seek? Is it to move far away from the cities and to live, that's the frontier kind of imaginary you have. But here we are in the middle of Toronto, 6 million people, and growing. So where do you cultivate these spaces, ideally, given the state of our democracies today?
I have a lot of ambivalence about this because fundamentally I have a very anarchist disposition about this. I used to feel very uncomfortable saying this, and now I completely believe in my own anarchism. As a sensibility, which is, I don't care how you do it. In fact, I think people should do it in quite different ways. That if you are the sort of person who wants to be democratically engaged, you should. And I do think probably it's a good idea for people to do that more, partly because I think the kinds of people who are attracted to that are not necessarily the kind of people you want doing it. So, I mean, if you've been to like meetings of your party or your local government, they are not rewarding experiences. They're really frustrating. They're very annoying, and they don't give you a lot of faith in the democratic they don't give me a lot of faith in the democratic process. So I think it is good to have some people who introduce a little friction into that system. But I also think that there are people who like to go to demonstrations. I don't actually like going. I do go to demonstrations pretty frequently these days, but I don't enjoy it. And there's a famous anthropology professor who I was once at a demonstration with. I didn't know him particularly, except that he was a famous guy, and he was standing next to me. And he would do the best thing. There were chants, and he'd go, hate chanting. And then he'd chant. And I thought this was hilarious. But then I thought, he's exactly right about that. Some things you have to do. It's a common, it's a thing you're doing together because it's a duty, but you really shouldn't like it necessarily. And so some people love it. Some people really find it invigorating and empowering, and they should do it. Because they're the people who will get the people like me who don't love chanting out there when they need to come. And then there are people who, and this I think probably should be everyone, people who just want to live a democratic life. And that means quite ordinary things, like judging the law, or I think of this as very Canadian. This might be a romantic myth we have in the States, but, like helping your neighbors, like the Midwest, that you actually do this thing. I mean, where my brother lives in northern Wisconsin, they do that thing. In Philadelphia, not so much maybe. But it is a good thing to do, and it's a good thing to do for the following reason. It's not that it's good to help people. It's good to help people, but that's not the reason politically. It's good because it is egalitarian, because it says this person is deserving of my respect. And to treat people that way in an ordinary kind of way. I think this is is this a Canadian thing? Good. There should be more of it. So that living a democratic life is what enables you to say no. Because powerful people come, and there are all too many of them, and people defer to them. I mean, it's quite ridiculous, really, how much people defer to the wealthy. Like, why? I mean, if they inherited it, then it's no credit to them. I mean, maybe they were good stewards, that's nice, but, maybe a different person is a good steward of the garden. It doesn't matter. And it certainly doesn't make them more worthy of your respect. And the same goes for intellectuals or people who occupy a position of government. They are your equals and they should be treated this way. That is its own form of respect. So I think that living a democratic life is important. I actually have, this is where my ambivalence arises. At the end of the book, I have a very bossy section, which I am having a confessional moment. I am confessing this to you, and I am both embarrassed by it and committed to it. So, where I tell people what to do, which, as I said, I don't really think I ought to be doing. And some of them, like here's one, we are all of equal worth, act accordingly. So they're very bossy. Your rights are yours. They do not depend on legal recognition. Seize them. I definitely believe that. Don't begrudge taxes. Taxes are how we do the work, how we pay for the work we do together. Now, my partner thought of this one. She said, taxes are how we pay for the work we do together. And I thought, yes, and I will give you a footnote. Because it is really true. People act like a tax is a robbery. And it is if you live under an authoritarian government. You know, if King Charles asks you for money, which of course he doesn't need, but even for a good purpose, that would be a kind of robbery, or I mean, there are other. The whole corporate dimension of this is much more awkward. But those are forms. A tax that's demanded of you without your consent, where you have no role in governance, that's robbery. But in a democracy, it's how you pay for the work we do together. And you may not like all the work equally. Nobody will. But a lot of the work, look where I'm living. There are lots of things that are going to happen in the next week. For who knows how long, that I will have to judge how much I need to do to resist them. But there will still be things that need to be maintained and that I will happily pay taxes for. So the recognition that whether I like it or not, I am involved in a common life with my people, I will pay my taxes proudly. That's what we do. Okay. So I have many other bossy imperatives in here too.
So there are lots of productive tensions in this book. So I want to ask two more. I have lots of questions, but I know you're all here, so I want to try to open up. So we'll try to keep this exchange maybe a bit short. So another tension is, as an anarchist, in that sense that you described, you're distrustful, skeptical of the state, wary of the state, because you want to reclaim that sovereignty for all of us. But yet, many of the things like taxes, right, are to fund states, and the most progressive democratic states have very high rates of taxes. So I take it you're not against good progressive democratic states, but even then, more of our life should be in these ungoverned spaces and places? Or is it the case that, I think, let me put it another way. I find what's really interesting in Anne's book is sometimes I read it and I can say, if you were, and I know all these words get contested, so just bear with me, right? Concepts, terms we use. Let's say I'm saying, you say, I distrust the state, I want it out of my life, I want as much freedom as possible. And when I read that in the book, I think, this sounds like a right-wing libertarian, or just say a libertarian, right? Don't want any centralized political authority interfering in my life. I know what's best for me. But then at other points in the book, and I think these are tensions in the book, could be good tensions, or maybe they're not tensions, maybe I've got it wrong. You say, well, we should have all these rights, and some of the rights are basic rights, right to food, shelter, clothing, but then there's also right to healthcare. We should have right to free speech, assembly, and the free media, but we have the right to say whatever we want. And even really interesting in the book, you can heckle. All of you can heckle right now, because in the book, Anne says, if you want to heckle the speaker, that's your right.
I tell my classes to heckle me.
Yeah.
So you want to heckle? Go right ahead.
So some of the rights that you advocate are what I think of as these sort of freedom from, this classic way we think about it, freedom from the state, freedom from authority. The other ones are very positive rights. I have a right to a wonderful education. I have a right to fantastic healthcare. And that's very sort of socialist idea of rights. So I guess my question is, doesn't that second set of rights really does depend on having really well-functioning democratic states? And if that's the case, how skeptical should we be of them? Because they're going to ask things of us, like taxes.
Exactly.
And high rates of taxes.
And I think that this is the thing, democracies, because they are made by the people in them, are going to look different. And so you should be able to decide how much you want. Do you want good schools? I do think education is a fundamental right. And so I think there should be schools. I think they should be open so anyone can attend them. Anyone who is able to should come. And I think that is the first of all, I think that if I believe, as I do, that each of you carries sovereignty within you, that people rule, not just the people, but people rule, then you had better educate them. You had better see that their minds are free and educated and able to do the work that they need to do as rulers. So, yeah, education, healthcare, I would and will happily pay taxes for that. The more the better, in fact. Well, up to a certain point. But if somebody decided, I would understand, but I would not live in a country in which people did not want to pay for those things.
Okay.
I would regard them with a certain level of contempt. But one of the things that's interesting about social democratic countries who spend a lot on free healthcare and education, I'm thinking here particularly of like Sweden or Norway, they also are very good about keeping certain kinds of anarchic spaces. One of the things I found out a while ago when I was thinking about these things was that in Sweden they have something called, which I'm not entirely perfect in my pronunciation about this, Allgemeinraten, which means you can go anywhere. You can walk through anyone's field. You can pick their berries. You can't sell them. You can't pick too much. But you can taste a few, eat a few for your lunch. That's perfectly fine. And when you go to look, so out of curiosity and being an American, I'm thinking, well, what if people do too much? Well, how do you know? How is this regulated? And I looked on the Swedish government website, and then I asked a government official, how do you regulate this? And they say, we don't. People use their judgment. And it works fine. So I think that those things do go together. I don't think they're really in contradiction.
Okay.
I think that's how you do that.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to all of you. And again, there's a lot more in this book, but let me try to focus on one more issue, which is, and you talked about it in your talk. So in the book, Anne talks about rights and duties. It says all democracies, all governments talk to us about our rights and duties. But as an anarchist, some of the rights here are radical and some of the duties are radical. One of the rights that's really radical, and you just said it now, but I'm going to emphasize it, is, Anne says in the book, you have a right to live wherever you want. Migrants have a right to seek refuge or asylum. They may be fleeing war, persecution, natural disaster, famine. They may simply be born out of place, as you put it. Right? So this is a really radical right, freedom of movement across the world. And then you talk about duties. And one of the duties you've talked about is duty to rebel. Now, you said that's a spectrum. It could be from not fully complying with the law. That's a silly law. You gave a lot of examples, but there's some big laws. And I was thinking about that. So we have seen in this country with the freedom, so it was called the Freedom Convoy on vaccine mandates.
Oh, yes.
We saw it in the United States. On January 6th, A few years ago, there was a rebellion that said, we do not trust this government, and we're going to, it's an insurrection, try to overthrow that state. Now, those citizens saw themselves as having a duty to rebel. And you talk about that in the book as well. So these are the more radical ends. I can see a lot of people saying, okay, well, these smaller cases, the stakes are low. Okay, you can have these rights, you can have these duties, but you push the envelope far in both directions. The rights that people have are radical. Anyone can enter from anywhere. No country belongs to any particular people. Maybe I read that wrong. And then there's the duty to rebel. And on the duty to rebel, we're going to have very serious differences about what is a just cause to rebel for, right? Now, how do you work through those kinds of issues? How do you work through the duty to rebel? What is a legitimate, just rebellion? What criteria do you use? When others will say that was unjust, they're trying to violate the rule of law and a fair process. But those citizens felt it genuinely, deeply, that they had to rebel against this state that they thought was a corrupt state.
They thought it was a stolen election. No, I do talk about January 6th in there for exactly that reason. On the one hand, there are some things that happen on January 6th among these insurrectionists that I think are absolute. When they come in and say, this is the people's house, I think they're exactly right. It is the people's house. If it is what it is meant to be, it is the people's house, and they should be able to enter. Do they have the right to, to break in, to beat people with poles and no. But also, and sort of more fundamentally, these are people who were misled. And this goes back to your point about education. That one of the problems that we have, you have it here too, but we have it worse, and that is the problem of misinformation. That it's very easy for misinformation to be spread. It's very difficult to combat, and they had been lied to. And a few of them have admitted it, but that ability of people to lie is a problem. But almost a bigger problem is the fact that they didn't want the people to rule. They wanted an authoritarian leader. And it wasn't about, let's make sure that the popular voice was heard. It was, no, let's rig the system so that we can reinstall this man that we want, who plans to rule in an authoritarian way. There's no democratic moment in that. And that is a problem. So that's a kind of easier one. The migration one is hard. And the migration one is also really important because there's a lot of it. There's always a lot of it for natural disasters or wars. And I think there are two things at work here. One is what you owe to another human being. And I think you do. If a refugee arrives, I think that one does owe something to them. Food, shelter, basic human things, freedom of speech. I don't think that you have to accept them as fellow citizens. That is a different thing. Because I think that people who rule themselves democratically, they do this because they want to engage in a common project. And the common project may be, we are the people who live on this land, we want to take care of it, we want to live a life that looks like this. And as good as that project is, that can be a very admirable project. Or it can be people who say, we believe certain things about government, we want to make these real in the world. whatever they choose. Now, I will not like all those choices equally, nor will you, but they all have the right to form a common project among each other.
Okay.
But they don't have to, if someone comes and says, well, I don't want to do that common project, I think the answer is something like, have some food and go on. And we're happy to talk to you about places that you might be more at home. But I think you can't forget basic human dignity. At the same time, you do have a right to defend your common project. Now, it's also important, though, especially when I look at Canada and the United States, we have done really well out of immigration. It has been great for us. I don't know how this works in Canada, but I recently had occasion to look at when the United States had the greatest amounts of immigration, it correlates exactly with when it became most prosperous. Now, I don't think that prosperity is the best measure of a good country, but it is worth noting that immigrants bring a lot, and immigrants build. So I have a lot of time for immigrants.